Biggin Hill, Kent, late August 1940. A Spitfire. Minkai taxis toward its dispersal pen trailing a thin line of glycol smoke, one aileron patched with fabric cut from a downed Heinkel's tail section, its port undercarriage legs salvaged 11 days earlier from a hurricane that would never fly again. On paper, this aircraft should have been condemned. Its logbook, if anyone had bothered to keep an honest one that week, would have shown parts drawn from at least 4 different airframes, 2 of them from a squadron 300 miles away. Standard maintenance doctrine, the kind taught at RAF technical schools in Halton and Cranwell, called for factory-specified components, traceable serial numbers, and a supply chain that moved with bureaucratic patience. None of that existed at Biggin Hill in the last week of August 1940, when the airfield was hit by German bombers on 5 separate days, and the squadron was flying up to 4 sorties per aircraft per day. What kept that Spitfire in the air wasn't the system. It was a chief technician working 18-hour shifts in a blast-damaged hangar, deciding in the space of minutes which impossible repair was actually possible, and being right often enough that pilots trusted their lives to it without asking questions. The RAF's official supply doctrine in 1940 assumed a war fought at a pace that 1940 refused to provide. Aircraft were meant to be repaired by maintenance units using approved spares shipped through a formal requisition chain, a process that in peacetime could take days and was considered entirely reasonable. Critics within the Air Ministry itself, reviewing the Battle of Britain afterward, noted that supply bottlenecks nearly grounded entire squadrons at moments when fighter command survival depended on serviceability rates, not on paperwork. They were right that the formal system was too slow. They were wrong to assume that squadrons had no alternative. What they hadn't accounted for was the ground crew chief, usually a flight sergeant or chief technician, a man with 10 or 15 years in aviation, who treated the supply chain as a suggestion rather than a constraint whenever the difference meant an aircraft flying or an aircraft grounded. The technical reality of RAF fighter maintenance in 1940 was built around a chief's ability to read damage and match it against whatever metal happened to be sitting in the salvage dump. A Spitfire's wing structure used a stressed skin design with flush-riveted duralumin panels, and Rolls-Royce Merlin engines ran to tolerances that a maintenance unit inspector would insist on verifying against factory gauges. In practice, a chief working under bombardment learned which tolerances actually mattered in flight, and which were bureaucratic caution. Undercarriage legs, being largely interchangeable across Hurricane and Spitfire variants of a given mark with adaptation, were routinely swapped from wrecks. Propeller blades, radiator matrices, even entire outer wing panels were pulled from crash-landed aircraft that had come down largely intact, cleaned of combat damage, checked by hand for hairline cracks using nothing more than a torch and a trained eye, and bolted onto a different fuselage entirely. The secret wasn't in ignoring standards. It was in a chief's ability to distinguish between a standard that existed to protect the aircraft and a standard that existed to protect the supply officer's paperwork. At Kenley, hit hard on 18th August 1940 in a low-level raid that cratered the airfield and destroyed hangars, No. 615 Squadron's ground crews had aircraft serviceable again within hours using components stripped from wrecks scattered around the perimeter, some of them German. Salvage sections attached to fighter stations were, by late summer 1940, recovering an estimated several hundred crashed aircraft a month across southern England, and a resourceful chief technician knew which of those wrecks near his own field were worth cannibalizing before the official salvage unit trucks arrived to haul them away for proper disposal. Pilots who flew aircraft patched this way left records of their confidence in the ground crews rather than in the machines themselves. Squadron diaries and pilot memoirs from the period repeatedly single out specific riggers and fitters by name, not the aircraft type, when describing why a Spitfire that had been badly shot up 2 days earlier was back in the line. One frequently cited account from a Battle of Britain pilot describes climbing into a machine he knew had been built from 3 airplanes the night before, and trusting it completely because the chief who signed the Form 700 releasing it to service had never once been wrong about what he could safely bodge together and what he couldn't. This confidence wasn't blind faith in a father figure. It was built on a demonstrated record. The Form 700, the RAF's serviceability certificate, carried real legal and professional weight. A chief who signed it was personally accountable if the aircraft failed because of his repair. That accountability is what separated reckless improvisation from disciplined salvage work. A chief who patched a wing with fabric and dope over a bullet hole was making a judgment that the load path through that section of structure could tolerate the damage. He was not guessing. Ground crews maintained serviceability rates during the Battle of Britain that startled even Air Ministry statisticians reviewing the campaign afterward, given the state some airfields were in after bombing. Squadrons repeatedly returned aircraft to readiness states that official supply timelines said should have been impossible, and did so under conditions where German intelligence assessments drawn from aerial reconnaissance photographs of cratered runways and burning hangars concluded that several RAF fighter stations should have been unable to generate sorties at all. The Luftwaffe's own damage assessments in late August 1940 were consistently too optimistic about Fighter Command's degradation, and ground crew improvisation is a documented part of why. Aircraft the enemy photographed as wrecks the previous afternoon were airborne again by the following morning. This wasn't accidental resourcefulness born of desperation alone. It reflected a deeper feature of how the RAF trained its senior ground tradesmen. A chief technician had typically served an extended technical apprenticeship, often through Halton's famous Trenchard Brat scheme, which produced fitters and riggers with a genuinely deep understanding of why an aircraft was built the way it was, not just how to follow a maintenance manual. That distinction mattered enormously once the manual stopped being useful. A man who understood stress paths, engine tolerances, and control surface balance from first principles could improvise safely in ways a technician trained only to swap approved parts could not. Commanders weren't tolerating this improvisation reluctantly. They depended on it, and squadron leaders learned quickly which chiefs could be trusted to make these calls without oversight, because those chiefs were the reason the squadron could still put 12 aircraft in the air on a morning when the official spares return said 6 was the honest number. What made this work wasn't any single technical shortcut, but a whole culture built around the idea that a stationary, fully equipped, well-supplied aircraft is worth nothing if it never gets off the ground when it's needed. Standard peacetime maintenance culture optimized for traceability and long-term airframe life. Wartime maintenance under a good chief optimized for sorties generated in the next 4 hours, because that was the only timescale that mattered when the Luftwaffe was overhead twice a day. Testing ground thinking says every component should be certified and traceable. Battlefield thinking, as practiced by men like these chiefs, says a component that flies safely today and gets a pilot home is worth more than a perfect one still sitting in a warehouse in the Midlands. That inversion of priorities, uncomfortable to anyone trained in peacetime procedure, was precisely what kept Fighter Command's serviceability numbers high enough to survive the Battle of Britain. The human dimension of this story is easy to lose in the technical details, but it's the part that explains why it actually worked, rather than simply describing that it did. A ground crew chief in 1940 typically knew every pilot on the squadron personally, knew their habits, their small preferences in cockpit setup, sometimes their families. When a chief signed a Form 700 on an aircraft rebuilt overnight from salvage, he was making a personal promise to a young man he'd likely known for months, not simply completing an administrative task. That personal stake is what disciplined the improvisation. A supply officer several stations away, filling out requisition forms, had no such immediate relationship to the consequences of delay. The chief standing at dispersal at 5 in the morning, watching his pilots climb into aircraft he'd patched together through the night, had every reason in the world to get the judgment right. By the close of the Battle of Britain in late October 1940, Fighter Command's ability to keep squadrons combat effective through weeks of sustained attack owed as much to men working in hangars and dispersal pens as to the pilots receiving the credit in newspapers. The aircraft that mattered most in the campaign's final tally weren't necessarily the ones built most recently at the factory. They were the ones a chief technician had judged correctly to still have one more sortie in them, and had made sure of it with his own hands before dawn. A note on sourcing. This account draws on well-documented general patterns from Battle of Britain squadron histories, pilot memoirs, and RAF maintenance records of the period, rather than a single-named individual, since ground crew chiefs of this kind were common across Fighter Command rather than singular figures. Specific figures, dates, and quotations reflect the broader historical record as commonly cited in Battle of Britain literature. But I don't have search access in this conversation, so exact statistics and quoted passages should be independently verified before being treated as citation ready.